The invitation did not look important. It was a simple message sent 3 days before the event. The community hall was hosting a formal evening gathering. Local business owners, teachers, and respected families would attend. There would be speeches, dinner, and soft music in the background. Someone had suggested that she could play the piano for a while. Not as the main performer, not as a featured guest, just to add a nice atmosphere. When she read the message, she smiled quietly. She was used to that tone. People often spoke about her music as if it were decoration. Something pleasant, something harmless, something light. She replied with a polite yes. On the evening of the event, the hall looked beautiful. Warm golden lights hung from the ceiling. Round tables were covered with white cloth. The stage stood at the front, and at its center was a polished black grand piano. It reflected the lights like a still lake. Guests arrived in elegant clothes. Laughter filled the air. Conversations overlapped. The smell of fresh food drifted through the room. She arrived alone, carrying nothing but a small folder of sheet music, though she barely needed it. She paused at the entrance for a moment, taking everything in. No one noticed her at first. People were too busy greeting each other. One of the organizers finally approached her with a quick smile. "Oh good, you're here," he said. "We just need something soft while people eat. Nothing too heavy. Just light music. Easy listening." She nodded gently. "Of course. Keep it simple," he added, almost as an afterthought. "It's just background. Just background." She had heard that phrase many times before. She walked toward the stage, feeling a few eyes on her now. Some guests whispered, trying to guess who she was. A few looked surprised, as if they had expected someone older. Others seemed relieved, probably thinking that a young woman would not play anything too serious. She placed her folder on the piano and adjusted the bench slowly. Her movements were calm, unhurried. Inside, her heart was steady. Not nervous, not anxious, just aware. She had played in rooms louder than this. She had played in rooms colder than this. She had played in rooms where no one listened at all. This was not new. As she sat down, a woman at a nearby table leaned toward her friend and said softly, "I hope she plays something cheerful. These formal events can get dull." Her friend laughed. "As long as it's not one of those dramatic pieces." The words floated toward the stage. She heard them clearly. She always did. For a brief second, she looked at the piano keys without touching them. The smooth black and white surface felt familiar. Safe. Honest. The organizer gave her a small nod from across the room. She began. The first notes were exactly what they had requested. Light, gentle. A simple melody that felt like sunlight through a window. Her fingers moved gracefully, barely lifting from the keys. The sound blended into the room like soft perfume. Guests continued talking. Glasses clinked. Forks touched plates. The music floated in the background, polite and controlled. A few people glanced toward the stage and then returned to their conversations. Some nodded approvingly, satisfied that she understood her role. She kept playing softly, her posture straight, her expression peaceful. But behind that calm face lived years of practice that no one in the room could see. She remembered the old piano she had learned on. It had chipped paint and uneven keys. Some notes stuck when pressed too hard. In winter, the room would be cold, and her fingers would ache before they warmed up. No one had called her talented back then. No one had told her she was special. In fact, there were times when she had been advised to lower her expectations, to avoid difficult pieces, to stay within limits. Choose something easier. One teacher had once told her long ago, "There's no need to challenge yourself too much." She had nodded politely then too, but she had gone home and practiced the harder piece anyway. Back in the hall, she continued playing the gentle melody. The rhythm was steady, predictable, safe. Yet inside her mind, something else was forming. She could feel the energy of the room, the way people dismissed the stage as decoration, the way they spoke freely, confident that the music would never demand their attention. It did not hurt her, but it did awaken something. Her hands moved into a soft transition. The melody shifted slightly, Still light, still appropriate, but layered now with subtle complexity. A deeper harmony rested beneath the cheerful tune. One man paused mid-sentence and glanced toward the piano. He did not know why. Something in the sound had changed. She kept her expression neutral. At another table, a young guest stopped scrolling on her phone and looked up. The music felt warmer now, more alive. Still, most conversations continued. She allowed the melody to return to simplicity, almost teasing the room with calmness. She was not rushing. There was no need. She believed in patience. As she played, memories surfaced quietly. Nights when she practiced until everyone else in the house had fallen asleep. Afternoons when she repeated the same difficult passage dozens of times until her wrists felt weak. She remembered performing once in a nearly empty hall. Only 3 people had attended. One of them had left halfway through. She had still played with her whole heart. Because for her, the music was never about applause. It was about truth. In the present moment, her fingers slowed slightly. She let the last soft chord linger longer than before. The sound hovered in the air. A few more heads turned. The organizer shifted in his seat. He seemed unsure whether the music was still light enough, but he said nothing. She began another piece. This one started even softer than the first, almost fragile. The notes felt like quiet footsteps on a wooden floor. The room gradually softened with it. Voices lowered without people realizing why. Laughter became quieter. The mood shifted from casual noise to gentle awareness. She was not forcing attention. She was inviting it. A group near the back of the hall finally stopped talking completely. One of them leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. Her playing was still delicate, still respectful of the request. But the emotion underneath was beginning to surface. It was subtle, honest, deep. She closed her eyes for a brief moment as her hands moved across the keys. In that second, the hall disappeared. The guests disappeared. The expectations disappeared. There was only the music, only the story hidden inside each note. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed something had changed. More people were looking at the stage now. Not all, but enough. She did not smile. She did not react. She simply continued. The melody grew slightly richer. The left hand carried a stronger pattern now, supporting the right with quiet strength. It was still appropriate, still elegant, but no longer forgettable. A fork clattered against a plate somewhere in the room, louder than before because the room itself had grown quieter. The organizer slowly set down his glass. His expression shifted from casual oversight to curiosity. She felt the shift, but she did not rush it. Her fingers danced lightly, almost playfully, across the higher keys. A sparkle entered the music, catching attention like light on water. A woman near the front table whispered, "She's actually very good." Her friend nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the stage. The music continued flowing, weaving softness with quiet power. It was still only the beginning, still only the surface. But beneath that surface was something waiting, something stronger, something undeniable. She ended the piece with a gentle closing phrase, letting the final note fade naturally into the room. This time, the silence afterward lasted a little longer than before. A few guests offered polite applause. Not loud, not overwhelming, but sincere. She inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. Then she placed her hands back on the keys. The evening was just beginning, and no one in that hall yet understood what they were about to witness. Long before that evening in the shining hall, her world looked very different. There were no golden lights, no polished grand piano, no guests dressed in formal clothes. There was only a small, quiet room with faded walls and a piano that had clearly lived many years before her. The first time she touched its keys, she was still a child. The piano stood in the corner of a community center where children gathered after school. Most of them ran outside to play. She stayed inside. The instrument was not beautiful. Some keys were slightly yellow. One of them made a soft clicking sound before the note came out. But when she pressed the first key, something inside her shifted. The sound was simple, just one note, but it felt alive. She pressed another key, then another. She did not know scales. She did not know technique. She only knew that when her fingers moved, the room felt less empty. At home, life was not always calm. There were responsibilities. There were worries that children should not have to understand, but she understood them anyway. Music became the one place where she did not feel small. Her family did not have extra money for private lessons, so she learned by watching. She would wait quietly during group classes at the center, listening carefully to what the instructor told the other students. When her turn came, she tried to remember every detail. Relax your hands. Sit straight. Feel the rhythm. She took those words seriously. When the center closed in the evenings, she often asked if she could stay just a little longer. Sometimes the staff allowed it. Sometimes they needed to lock up and go home. On the nights she had to leave, she would imagine the keyboard on her bedroom desk. She traced invisible keys with her fingers on the table surface, practicing silently in the dark. Years passed that way. She grew taller. Her hands grew stronger. The simple melodies she once struggled with became easy. But instead of feeling satisfied, she became curious. She wanted to understand the deeper music, the kind that made people close their eyes, the kind that carried stories without words. One afternoon, she found an old book of advanced piano pieces in a dusty cabinet at the center. The pages were slightly torn. Some notes were faded, but the music inside was powerful. She opened to a random page and stared at it. The notes looked complicated, almost frightening. Her heart beat faster just looking at them. When the instructor saw the book in her hands, he smiled gently but shook his head. "That's too difficult right now," he said. "You should focus on simpler pieces. Build step by step." She nodded politely, but that night, she could not stop thinking about those pages. The next day, when no one was paying attention, she opened the book again. She placed it on the piano stand and slowly began to figure out the first line. It sounded messy at first, uneven, broken. She tried again, and again. Her fingers stumbled. Her timing was off. More than once, she felt frustration rise in her chest. But each small improvement felt like climbing a mountain step by step. She did not tell anyone she was practicing those difficult pieces. It became her private challenge. At school, some classmates knew she played piano. They would sometimes ask her to perform something cheerful during small events. She always did. She enjoyed making people smile. But deep inside, she carried something more serious. A quiet hunger to grow beyond what others expected. Once, during a small recital at the community center, she decided to play one of the harder pieces she had been secretly practicing. She did not announce it. She simply sat down and began. Halfway through, she made a mistake. A noticeable one. Her hands slipped, and the melody broke for a second. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Her face felt warm. Her heart raced. For a brief moment, she thought about stopping. Instead, she kept going. She finished the piece not perfectly but completely. Afterward, someone approached her and said kindly, "That was brave, but maybe you should stick to lighter songs for now." She thanked them with a small smile. The comment stayed with her for days. Maybe you should stick to lighter songs. She understood the concern. The piece had been challenging. She had not mastered it fully yet. But something about being told to stay small did not sit right with her. She began waking up earlier to practice before school. The community center opened at sunrise for cleaning staff, and one of them noticed her dedication. Slowly, they formed an unspoken agreement. If she arrived early and left everything neat, she could use the piano before others came. Those early mornings became her favorite time. The world outside was quiet. The air felt fresh. No one was watching. No one was judging. It was just her and the music. In those hours, she allowed herself to fail, to repeat the same passage 20 times if needed, to slow down the tempo until each note felt steady under her fingers. She learned that mastery was not about showing off. It was about patience. Her hands developed strength but also sensitivity. She began to understand that the piano was not only about pressing keys. It was about listening, about breathing with the melody. As she grew older, opportunities came and went. Some competitions required fees she could not afford. Some advanced programs were far from home. She watched others move ahead with advantages she did not have. There were moments when doubt whispered in her mind. What if she was dreaming too big? What if the people who told her to keep it simple were right? But every time doubt grew louder, she returned to the piano. Music never asked about her background. It never questioned her worth. It responded only to effort and honesty. Once, a visiting musician held a short workshop at the community center. He listened to several students play. When it was her turn, she chose a piece that blended softness with complexity. After she finished, he looked at her thoughtfully. "You play with feeling," he said, "but don't be afraid of depth. Light music is beautiful, but depth leaves a mark." Those words stayed with her. Depth leaves a mark. From that day on, she practiced not only to improve her technique but to understand emotion. She paid attention to how different chords created different moods. She experimented with dynamics, learning when to whisper through the keys and when to let the sound rise. Years of quiet effort shaped her into someone who did not panic under pressure. She had already faced empty rooms. She had already faced gentle discouragement. She had already faced her own mistakes. Each challenge became part of her strength. So when she received the invitation to play at the formal gathering, she did not see it as a small opportunity. She saw it as another room, another piano, another chance, not to prove others wrong, but to express everything she had built inside herself. The guests at that elegant hall did not know about the early mornings. They did not know about the dusty music book. They did not know about the mistake during the recital years ago. They saw only a young woman in a simple dress, sitting calmly at a grand piano. They did not see the child who once traced invisible keys on a wooden desk. They did not see the teenager who practiced until her fingers felt numb. They did not see the countless quiet choices she made to push beyond something light. But all of that lived inside her hands. And when those hands touched the keys that evening, they carried every lesson, every doubt, every determined sunrise with them. Her brilliance did not appear in one night. It was built slowly, note by note, day by day, in rooms where no one was watching. The applause after her second piece was polite, but different from before. Carried curiosity now, not just appreciation but interest. She gave a small nod and turned back to the piano. The room was quieter than when she first began. Conversations had not stopped completely, but they were softer. People were listening even if they did not fully realize it yet. A waiter walked carefully between tables, trying not to disturb the growing stillness. The sound of plates and glasses no longer felt louder than the music. The balance had shifted. She placed her hands on the keys again, but this time she did not begin immediately. She let the silence sit for a moment. It was not dramatic. It was not forced. It was simply a pause, a breath. Then she began a new melody, started gently, almost like a question. The right hand carried a clear, simple line. The left hand supported it with soft, steady chords. At first, it sounded just as light as the organizer had requested. But there was something different underneath. The notes were shaped carefully, not rushed. Each phrase felt complete, thoughtful. A group of guests near the center of the hall slowly stopped talking. One of them leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand what had changed. The melody repeated, but not exactly the same. This time she added a small variation, a subtle shift in harmony, a deeper tone in the lower keys. The room responded. It was not loud. It was not sudden. But like a tide slowly turning, attention began moving toward the stage. She remained calm. Her shoulders relaxed. Her fingers moved with confidence that came from years of repetition. She was no longer thinking about what to play next. Her hands already knew. At a table near the front, a woman who had earlier whispered about wanting cheerful music now sat very still. Her eyes were fixed on the pianist's hands. "She's telling a story," she murmured without meaning to. The piece continued to unfold. The melody grew richer. The left hand began to travel farther down the keyboard, creating a fuller sound. The lightness was still there, but it was no longer fragile. It had weight now. One of the organizers shifted in his seat. He had expected background music, something pleasant and easy to ignore, but ignoring this felt impossible. She transitioned smoothly into a new section. The tempo increased slightly, not fast but alive. The notes began to connect more tightly, flowing into each other like a stream gaining speed. A man near the back who had been checking his phone slowly lowered it to the table. He did not look away again. The music rose gently, building layer by layer. She was careful not to overwhelm too quickly. She understood the power of patience. Every time the melody seemed ready to settle back into softness, she added something new. A stronger chord, a quicker run up the keys, a sudden drop into a lower register that vibrated softly through the floor. The sound of cutlery had completely stopped. Now the only sounds in the hall were the piano and the faint hum of the air system above. She felt it. The shift. The room was hers now. Not in a proud way. Not in a controlling way. But in a shared way. The audience was with her whether they had planned to be or not. She allowed the music to soften again, almost as if giving everyone a moment to breathe. The melody returned to simplicity, reminding them of how she had started earlier in the evening. But now they understood something they had not before. This simplicity was a choice, not a limit. Her fingers moved into a delicate passage high on the keyboard. The notes sparkled lightly, like distant stars. Felt gentle, but her control was clear. Every sound was placed with care. In the silence between phrases, you could feel the tension growing. What would she do next? At a corner table, an elderly guest who had spent years studying classical music sat with his hands folded. He had remained quiet all evening. Now his eyes were slightly wide, and there was a small smile on his face. He recognized the skill behind the softness. She shifted again. This time, the left hand introduced a deeper rhythm. Steady, strong. It grounded the entire piece. Over it, the right hand began a more demanding pattern, weaving in and out of the main melody. The music was no longer background. It was presence. A young child sitting beside her parents leaned forward, completely still. Even without understanding technique, the child could feel that something important was happening. The tempo increased once more. Not wildly, not carelessly, but with intention. Her hands moved faster now, crossing slightly as she reached for notes that stretched across the keyboard. The sound filled the hall, reaching every corner without needing amplification. Some guests exchanged glances. Their earlier assumptions felt distant now. She was not just someone playing softly at dinner. She was commanding the instrument. The melody returned once more, but now it carried emotion that had not been there before. Felt fuller, deeper, as if it had traveled somewhere and come back changed. Her face remained focused, but there was warmth in her expression. She was not trying to impress. She was sharing something real. The organizer who had told her to keep it simple slowly leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He was no longer thinking about the schedule or the flow of the evening. He was listening. The music swelled into a powerful section. Not loud in a harsh way, but strong and confident. Her hands moved with precision, never striking too hard, never losing clarity. The grand piano responded beautifully under her touch. Each note rang clear and balanced. There was no talking now. The entire hall had fallen silent. She felt the energy in the room, but she did not let it distract her. She had learned long ago not to chase applause, not to perform for approval. She played for the truth of the piece itself. As the passage grew more complex, her fingers moved with ease that came only from deep practice. The difficult sections that once felt impossible in her childhood now flowed naturally. Years of early mornings lived in those movements. Years of quiet determination. She reached the peak of the piece. A fast, intricate run that traveled from the lowest keys to the highest in one smooth wave. The sound shimmered across the hall like light breaking through clouds. A few guests inhaled sharply, but she did not stop there. Instead of ending on that high point, she pulled the music back gently. slowing, softening, allowing the intensity to settle into something tender. The final section felt intimate, personal, as if she were no longer playing for a room full of people, but for one listener at a time. Her hands slowed further. The rhythm relaxed. The melody returned to the simple theme from the beginning of the piece, but now it carried everything that had happened in between. Growth, strength, confidence. She pressed the final chord softly, letting it resonate fully before lifting her hands. The sound hung in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. For several long seconds, there was only silence. Not the careless silence from earlier in the evening when people were distracted. This silence was different. It was full. And in that stillness, every person in the hall understood that something had shifted. They had expected something light, but what they had just experienced was something far more powerful. The silence after the last note did not feel empty. It felt heavy, but in a beautiful way. No one wanted to break it too quickly. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys and rested them gently on her lap. Her breathing was steady. She did not look around right away. She simply let the moment settle. Then the applause began. At first, it came from one table near the front. A few claps, firm and clear. Then another table joined. Within seconds, the entire hall filled with the sound of hands coming together. This was no longer polite appreciation. It was genuine. Some guests even stood up without planning to. They did not look at each other before rising. It just happened naturally, like a shared understanding. She stood slowly from the bench and gave a small bow. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes carried warmth. She could feel the difference in the room. The energy had changed completely. The organizer who had earlier asked her to keep it simple was clapping harder than most. There was surprise on his face, but also respect. When the applause softened, she returned to her seat. The evening was still ongoing. Dinner plates were half full. Glasses remained on tables. But now, no one was treating the piano as background decoration. They were waiting. She placed her fingers on the keys again. This time, she did not begin with something light. She started with a deep, rich chord that echoed through the hall. It was bold but not harsh, confident but not aggressive. The room quieted instantly. Her left hand introduced a steady rhythm, strong and grounded. Her right hand entered with a melody that felt powerful from the very first note. There was no slow build this time, no gentle introduction. She had already shown them her softness. Now she would show them her strength. The tempo moved forward with purpose. Her hands traveled across the keyboard with speed and control. The notes came alive under her touch, clear and bright. Guests leaned forward in their seats. A few people who had stepped outside earlier quietly slipped back into the hall, drawn by the sound. They paused near the entrance, unsure whether to move or stay still. The music was intense now, not chaotic, but passionate. Each phrase carried emotion that felt honest and raw. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her wrists flexible. She had practiced this kind of control for years. Fast passages did not scare her anymore. Her fingers flew across the keys in a rapid run that seemed almost impossible to follow. Yet every note landed perfectly. The sound did not blur. It rang sharp and precise. A quiet gasp came from somewhere near the center of the room. Even those who did not understand music could sense the difficulty of what she was playing. The melody shifted suddenly into a softer section. But this softness was different from earlier. It was not light. It was reflective, deep, like a quiet thought after a powerful conversation. She closed her eyes briefly, letting her hands move without looking. She trusted them completely. The piano responded like an old friend. The music rose again, stronger this time. Her left hand carried heavy chords that vibrated through the floor. Her right hand danced above them, weaving complex patterns with ease. It felt like fire contained inside structure. One of the guests, a well-known musician in the area, sat very still at his table. He had been invited as a respected figure for the evening. Many people admired his work. Now he was the one listening carefully. He watched her technique, the way she controlled dynamics, the way she shaped each phrase. He could see that this was not accidental talent. This was discipline. This was years of quiet work. The music climbed higher, building tension with every measure. Her hands crossed over each other smoothly, never colliding, never hesitating. The room held its breath. At the peak of the piece, she struck a powerful sequence of chords that echoed boldly. The sound filled every corner of the hall, bouncing gently off the walls before settling back into silence. But she did not stop. Instead, she moved directly into a fast, brilliant passage that demanded complete focus. Her fingers moved with such speed that they almost blurred under the lights. Yet her face remained calm. There was no struggle in her expression, no sign of panic, only concentration and quiet confidence. A few guests exchanged wide-eyed looks. The woman who had once whispered about wanting something cheerful now sat with her hand over her mouth, completely amazed. The music surged forward, then pulled back suddenly into a delicate whisper. The contrast was breathtaking. From fire to featherlight in seconds. She was in full control. The respected musician at the table slowly began to smile. He understood what others were only beginning to realize. She was not simply talented. She was brilliant. The final section of the piece approached. The rhythm intensified once more. Strong chords rolled from the lower keys upward in waves of sound. Her hands moved with fearless energy. Each note carried clarity. Each transition felt intentional. Then, with one final powerful run across the entire keyboard, she reached the ending. She struck the last chord firmly. The sound rang out, bold and unwavering. And then she lifted her hands. Silence. Not confusion. Not hesitation. Pure silence filled with awe. For a long second, no one moved. Then the applause erupted again, louder than before. People stood fully this time. Not just a few. Almost everyone. The respected musician rose slowly from his seat. His expression was thoughtful, but his applause was strong. She stood and bowed once more, slightly deeper than before. She did not rush off the stage. She did not look overwhelmed. But inside, she felt something shift. Not pride. Not relief. Something steadier. Validation of years spent practicing when no one was watching. The organizer approached the stage as the applause continued. He looked slightly embarrassed, but he was smiling. "I think," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying through the hall, "we may have underestimated our performer tonight." Soft laughter filled the room, warm and friendly. "She was told to play something light," he continued. "Instead, she gave us something unforgettable." The applause grew even louder. She felt her cheeks warm slightly, but she remained composed. The respected musician stepped forward as well. He did not take the microphone. He simply extended his hand toward her. She shook it politely. "You have remarkable control," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "And even more remarkable heart." Those words meant more than the applause, because they came from someone who truly understood. As the evening slowly returned to its program, something had changed permanently. Guests spoke about her performance in low, excited voices. Some replayed certain moments in their minds. Others tried to describe the feeling but struggled to find the right words. She returned to the piano once more, this time choosing a softer piece again, allowing the room to settle. But now the softness felt different. It was respected. It was listened to. No one spoke over it. No one dismissed it. The same hands that had once been expected to provide background music were now the center of the evening. And as she played those final gentle notes, she understood something clearly. Being told to stay light had never limited her. It had simply given her the perfect moment to reveal her depth. The applause did not fade quickly this time. It rolled through the hall in waves, rising and falling, but never fully disappearing. Even after she stepped away from the strongest piece of the night and returned to something softer, the energy in the room remained charged. People were no longer eating. Plates sat untouched. Conversations were paused mid-thought. Every eye that turned toward the stage now carried a different expression than earlier in the evening. Respect. She finished the final gentle piece with a calm, graceful ending. Her hands lifted slowly from the keys, and she allowed the last note to disappear naturally into the quiet air. For a moment, no one reacted again. That silence felt even deeper than before. It was not shock now. It was absorption. People were holding on to the feeling, not wanting it to slip away too quickly. Then the applause began once more, stronger than at any other point that evening. Several guests stood up immediately. Chairs moved back against the floor. Some clapped above their shoulders. Others simply kept their hands steady but firm, their faces full of admiration. She stood and bowed gently. This time, when she looked up, she allowed herself to truly see the room. The same people who once whispered about keeping things light were now smiling openly. Some nodded toward her with quiet approval. A few looked almost emotional, as if the music had touched something personal. The organizer approached the stage again, but this time there was no hint of doubt in his posture. He looked proud, almost protective. He stepped forward and addressed the room. "I think we can all agree," he said warmly, "that tonight we witnessed something special." The crowd responded with more applause. He turned toward her and added, "Thank you for giving us far more than we expected." She smiled politely and stepped back from the microphone. She did not need to say anything. The music had already spoken. As guests slowly began to move again, many did not return to their previous conversations. Instead, they made their way toward the stage. One by one, they approached her. A woman from the front table spoke first. "I didn't realize how powerful piano could feel," she admitted softly. "You changed the entire mood of the evening." She thanked her with a gentle nod. Another guest said, "When you started, I thought it would just be background music. But that last piece, it felt alive." Each comment was sincere. None of them felt exaggerated. She listened carefully, responding with simple gratitude. She did not boast. She did not downplay her effort either. She simply accepted their words. The respected musician who had shaken her hand earlier stepped closer once more. This time he spoke a little louder, though still calm. "Your control over dynamics is impressive," he said. "But what truly stands out is your emotional maturity. That cannot be taught easily." A few guests nearby overheard and nodded in agreement. Hearing that from someone experienced meant more than applause. It confirmed what she had quietly worked toward for years. Another organizer approached, slightly embarrassed. "I hope you didn't mind when we asked for something light," he said. "We had no idea." She smiled kindly. "It's okay," she replied. "Light can still hold depth." He paused, reflecting on her words. Meanwhile, small groups across the hall continued talking about her performance. "Did you see how fast her hands moved? The way she shifted from soft to powerful. It gave me chills." The room that once treated her music as decoration now treated it as the highlight of the evening. She stepped away from the piano for a moment, giving others space to admire it. She stood near the edge of the stage, watching quietly as guests slowly returned to their seats. But something had changed in their posture. They sat straighter now. They spoke softer. The atmosphere felt more thoughtful. Even the lighting seemed warmer somehow. As the formal part of the event resumed, a few speakers gave short talks. But even during those speeches, people occasionally glanced toward the piano, as if it held a memory they did not want to forget. She remained seated near the stage, calm and composed. Inside, she felt something steady growing. Not excitement, not pride, gratitude. Gratitude for the old piano at the community center. Gratitude for the early mornings. Gratitude even for the people who once told her to stay within limits. Because without those moments, she would not have developed the quiet strength she carried tonight. Later in the evening, as guests began preparing to leave, a small group gathered near her again. One person asked where she had studied. Another asked how long she had been playing. She answered honestly, "Years of practice, many simple beginnings, a lot of patience, no dramatic story, just consistency." A young guest, perhaps inspired, asked softly, "Were you nervous?" She considered the question for a moment. "A little," she admitted, "but I trust the music." That answer seemed to settle something in the young listener's eyes. As coats were collected and goodbyes exchanged, many guests made sure to thank her personally before leaving. Some shook her hand firmly. Others simply offered a warm smile. The organizer approached her one final time near the exit. "We would be honored to have you perform again at future events," he said sincerely. She nodded. "I'd be happy to." When the hall finally began to empty, the noise of the evening faded into a soft echo. Staff members quietly cleared tables. Chairs were stacked carefully. The golden lights dimmed slightly. She returned to the piano one last time before leaving. The room was nearly empty now. She placed her fingers on the keys gently and played a few quiet notes, just for herself. No audience. No expectations. The sound felt different in the near-empty hall. More personal. More intimate. She closed her eyes briefly. She thought about the first time she had pressed a key as a child. She thought about the dusty music book. She thought about being told to keep things simple. And she realized something important. Being underestimated had never truly harmed her. It had shaped her. It had pushed her to build depth quietly, without depending on praise. She lifted her hands and let the final soft note fade away. The hall stood silent around her. But it was not the same silence from earlier in the evening. This silence carried memory. As she walked toward the exit, she did not feel like someone who had just shocked a room full of people. She felt like someone who had finally been seen. And sometimes that is even more powerful than applause. The night air outside the hall felt cooler than she expected. When she stepped out, the sound of the door closing behind her seemed louder than usual. Inside, the evening was still slowly ending. Outside, everything was quiet. The streetlights cast soft circles of light onto the pavement. A few cars remained parked nearby, but most guests had already left. She paused for a moment at the top of the steps. The applause was no longer in her ears, yet she could still feel it somewhere deeper. Not as noise, but as memory, as recognition. She walked down the steps slowly, holding her small folder close to her side. It felt lighter than when she had arrived, even though nothing inside had changed. Her phone buzzed gently in her hand. Messages were already coming in. Someone had recorded a part of her performance and shared it. A short clip was circulating among guests who had attended. Compliments filled the screen. "You were incredible. I've never heard piano played like that in person. You truly shocked everyone." She read a few messages, then locked the screen. She appreciated the words, but she did not want to get lost in them. She knew how quickly attention could rise and fade. What mattered most was not what they wrote. What mattered was what she felt when her hands touched the keys. As she began walking down the quiet street, her mind replayed small moments from the evening. The first soft note, the shifting silence, the gasp during the fast passage, the way the respected musician had looked at her, not with surprise, but with understanding. She realized something important. Tonight had not been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about no longer shrinking herself to make others comfortable. For years she had been careful. Careful not to seem too ambitious. Careful not to choose pieces that might be called too much. Careful not to stand out in rooms where expectations were small. But tonight, when she moved from light melodies into deeper, stronger music, she had not asked for permission. She had simply played, and that made all the difference. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. The night before had been long, but her mind felt awake, clear. Sunlight entered her room softly. She sat at the edge of her bed for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. Her phone buzzed again. More messages. Some from people she barely knew. A few from guests asking if she offered lessons. One from the organizer confirming they wanted her to perform at another upcoming event. She smiled gently. It was nice. But she knew that one performance did not define a life. It was a moment. Powerful one, yes, but still a moment. She made her way to the piano she kept at home. It was not as grand as the one from the hall, but it was hers. Familiar. Honest. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys. No audience. No applause. No expectations. She began to play something simple. Not because she had been told to, but because she wanted to. The notes flowed softly through the room. They did not need to impress anyone. They did not need to shock anyone. They only needed to be true. As she played, she thought about the younger version of herself sitting in that community center years ago. The chipped keys, the early mornings, the dusty music book. If that younger version could see her now, she would probably be surprised. Not because of the applause, but because she had stayed consistent. She had not given up when she was told to keep things light. She had not allowed small comments to shrink her dreams. Later that week, she received an invitation to perform at a larger venue in the city. Word had spread beyond that one hall. People were curious. They wanted to hear the pianist who had transformed a formal dinner into something unforgettable. She accepted calmly, not with excitement that rushed her thoughts, but with steady confidence. When she arrived at the new venue days later, the setting was bigger, the audience larger, the expectations higher. This time, no one asked her to play something light. Instead, they asked her what she would like to perform. That question felt different, felt like respect. She chose her pieces carefully, some soft, some powerful, some complex. When she stepped onto the stage, she remembered the first event clearly. The whispers, the polite smiles, the low expectations. She felt grateful for that night, because it had reminded her that brilliance does not need to announce itself loudly. It reveals itself when given space. The performance in the city was beautiful. The audience listened from the first note. There were no side conversations, no clinking glasses, but strangely, she felt the same calm she had felt in the small community hall. Because the size of the room did not matter. What mattered was the honesty of her playing. After the concert, someone approached her and said, "You play like someone who has nothing to prove." She thought about that for a moment. Maybe that was true. She no longer needed to shock anyone. She no longer needed to silence doubt. She simply needed to keep growing. Weeks passed. More invitations came. Some larger, some smaller. She accepted many of them, but she also returned often to the community center where she had first learned. One afternoon, she walked into that familiar room. The old piano was still there, though it had been repaired slightly over the years. A group of young students sat around it practicing scales. They looked up when she entered. Some recognized her from the video clips that had spread locally. "Is it true you made everyone stand and clap?" one child asked with wide eyes. She laughed softly. "They stood because they felt something," she replied. "Not because I forced them to." She sat at the old piano and played a few notes. The sound was not perfect, but it felt meaningful. She turned to the students and said, "Don't let anyone decide how deep you're allowed to go. Start light if you need to, but don't stay there if your heart wants more." They listened carefully. She did not give a long speech. She did not need to. Her story was enough. That evening, as she walked home again under quiet streetlights, she felt peace. The night when she was told to play something light had become more than a performance. It had become a turning point, not because the audience changed, but because she did. She understood now that brilliance is not about being loud. It is about being fully present. It is about trusting years of unseen work. It is about refusing to shrink when given the chance to expand. And sometimes all it takes is one simple request. Play something light, to reveal just how powerful someone truly is.